She thought she was just chasing a runaway pig, but what she found in those hills would test her vows, expose a buried truth, and decide the fate of an entire valley. Stay with me until the end, and I'll show you how one quiet nun, armed with nothing but faith and mercy, brought down a mountain of lies and lit a fire that changed everything. This isn't just a story about faith, it's about courage in the quiet places and what happens when the truth refuses to stay buried. So if you're ready to walk through dust, danger, and a test of conscience guided by God's light, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like and comment one below so I know you're listening. Because what Sister Abigail did out there in those hills was nothing short of a reckoning. They say even the Lord's servants sometimes have to step off holy ground to find what's been lost. Sister Abigail never expected her day to begin with sin, especially not the kind that came on 4 muddy hooves and a snorting nose. But just after morning prayers, when she stepped out into the misty light of dawn, she noticed the gate to the pen was open and the convent's prized sow Bessie was gone. That pig wasn't just livestock, she was provision. The last real thing the sisters owned that could bring in enough coin to keep their struggling mission open through the harsh desert winter. If they lost her, they'd have to shutter the chapel, send the orphans away, and pray someone else could finish the Lord's work they had started in this forgotten patch of dry earth. So Sister Abigail did something she hadn't done since her novitiate years. She disobeyed. She didn't ask permission. She didn't alert Mother Superior. She simply laced up her worn boots, grabbed her rosary, and followed the tracks through the dewy grass, whispering Hail Marys with every step. Bessie's prince led her farther than she'd ever gone alone, past the mission's borders, beyond the brittle fence line her bishop warned never to cross. Too wild, he'd said, too many secrets in those hills. But Sister Abigail wasn't thinking of danger. She was thinking of duty and of a pig with a nose for trouble. As she climbed the rocky slope, the desert rose before her like a parable, dusty, stubborn, and waiting to test her faith. The sun had barely crested the ridge when she heard it, not the snort of a pig, but something lower, weaker. A human groan, faint but unmistakable. Sister Abigail paused, her heart thumping like chapel bells before Mass. A voice inside her warned her to turn back. But the same voice that had led her to God years ago now urged her forward. There, tucked between 2 jagged stones, like a secret buried by angels, she found him. A man broken and bleeding, barely clinging to life. His eyes flickered open, dazed but aware. And for a moment, just a moment, he looked at her as if she were the last good thing he'd ever see. "Please," he whispered, "don't tell anyone I'm here." Sister Abigail stood frozen. Her vows didn't prepare her for this. She had been trained to tend wounds of the soul, not bullet holes in strangers' flesh. But something deeper stirred something she hadn't felt in years. Compassion, righteous fury, a sense that perhaps, just perhaps, this wasn't an accident at all. That pig hadn't wandered off. She'd led Sister Abigail into a test of faith. And what she would choose next might change the fate of every soul in that valley. Before I tell you what she found in those rocks, if stories like this speak to your heart about faith tested in the dust of the West, about quiet courage and God's hand in unexpected places, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment one below, so I know you're listening. Your support helps keep these stories alive for those who still believe in mercy, justice, and the strength of a soul led by grace. Now, back to the moment Sister Abigail heard that groan echo through the canyon and knew she wasn't alone. She had taken vows to serve, to obey, to trust in God's plan. But no part of Sister Abigail's calling had prepared her for the sight before her now. The man was lying half hidden in a cradle of stone and thorns, his body battered, clothes torn and blood-stained. His breath came in ragged wheezes, his skin pale as the altar cloth on Easter morning. A single hand gripped a worn leather pouch as if it were his last possession, or his last secret. And standing beside him, nuzzling curiously at his boot, was Bessie. Of course. Abigail had followed that stubborn sow through brush and bramble, over hills her bishop warned were no place for a woman of the cloth. But now, seeing this man bleeding out beneath heaven's indifferent sky, she began to understand. This wasn't chance. It was providence. Still, her hands trembled. He could be an outlaw, a fugitive, a soul bent on wickedness. The world was full of such men, especially out here, where the law rode on horses and justice came late, if it came at all. Don't tell anyone, the man rasped again. Please. Sister Abigail sank to her knees beside him. She looked at the rosary wrapped tight around her wrist, a habit of hers when she was afraid. Her thoughts turned to her vows, poverty, chastity, obedience. And then to the man before her, helpless, hunted, and possibly dying. What happened to you? She asked, voice steady but low. They found out what I knew, he murmured. What I took. He tried to lift the pouch, but his hands shook violently. Inside proof. Your land, this whole valley, it's not worthless. Railroad men, buying it cheap, tricking your people. They've got men in town hiding in plain sight. I worked for them, till I couldn't anymore. Abigail blinked. For years the mission had struggled. The soil was dry, donations scarce. The land considered cursed, useless. But now this. She reached for the pouch, but he held it back. Promise me, he said, his voice cracking. Be careful. Don't trust anyone. These men, they've killed for this. The weight of his words settled on her like the desert sun. She could leave him here, walk away, return to her chapel and pretend she saw nothing. But what kind of servant would that make her? Of God or of fear? I'll help you, she said at last. I don't know what it all means yet, but I know this. I won't let you die out here alone, not while I still draw breath. He relaxed slightly, finally releasing the pouch. Above them, a hawk circled once, then flew east toward the rising light. Abigail whispered a prayer under her breath, not for guidance, for courage, because she knew now this wasn't just a wounded man. This was a message from God. And what she chose next would decide more than one life. It might decide the fate of the entire valley. If this story speaks to you, hit subscribe, give it a like, and share in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between silence and doing what's right? Now let's get back to Sister Abigail and the men who do anything to keep the truth buried. Sister Abigail had barely hidden the pouch beneath her habit when she heard voices. 3 of them carried on the morning breeze like a warning. They were coming, and they weren't praying. She rose quickly, brushing the dust from her knees. The wounded man Boone Carter, he had called himself, had drifted back into unconsciousness. There wasn't time to move him, and certainly no time to understand the full weight of what he'd handed her. All she could do was slip back through the brush, leading Bessie by her rope, praying her absence hadn't already raised alarm. But the men were faster than she'd hoped. At the edge of the rocky trail stood Mr. Hunter Harrison, the storekeeper from town. Only now he wasn't wearing his usual friendly smile. His eyes were sharp, watchful, predatory. Flanking him were 2 others, one a stranger with a rifle, the other a deacon from the parish. Her stomach turned. Well now, Harrison said, tipping his hat. Didn't expect to find a woman of God this far from the Lord's house. I was retrieving the convent's pig, Abigail answered evenly. She wandered off again. She go climbing over rocks and into caves? The stranger asked, squinting. Abigail forced a soft chuckle. Bessie never did know where the line was drawn. It was a light answer. But they weren't looking for jokes. We're tracking someone, Harrison said. A thief. Dangerous sort, might be wounded. Might even try to fool someone into helping him. "Have you seen anything out here?" the deacon asked gently, but his eyes searched her face as if he already knew the answer. Abigail's pulse quickened. The pouch under her robe felt heavier with every breath. She could lie, say no, say she saw nothing. She could return to her convent and let the men chase shadows in the hills. But would that be a sin? She had taken vows. To God, to truth. But hadn't Jesus himself turned over tables in the temple when the righteous were being cheated? Hadn't Esther lied to save her people? Weren't some truths worth protecting until the time was right? Her silence stretched just a second too long. Harrison stepped closer. "Miss Abigail, you're a woman of the cloth. That still means something in this valley. So let me ask you again. Did you see anything strange out there?" She looked him square in the eye. Only rock's dust and the sound of God's wind whistling through thorn bush. He studied her, then smiled thin and cold. "Then you won't mind if we check the area ourselves?" Her heart sank. They would find Boone. He wouldn't survive. The truth would die with him. Unless... "Before you go," she said, clutching her rosary, "perhaps we could pray together. That God guide your search and reveal only what needs revealing." A pause, a test. Harrison's eyes narrowed, but the deacon bowed his head. "That would be right," he said. As they prayed, Sister Abigail whispered silently to heaven, not for protection, but for forgiveness. Because her lie was holy, and her war had just begun. If this tale of faith and grit moves your spirit, click subscribe, give it a like, and tell me in the comments. Have you ever felt the Lord nudge you to speak up when silence was easier? Now let's go back to that candlelit chapel where truth waited in a leather pouch and one nun dared to open it. That night, long after the sun dipped behind the chapel's steeple and the candles in the sanctuary had burned low, Sister Abigail stood alone in the convent's tiny chapel. Her knees ached on the cold stone floor. Her hands trembled around the worn leather pouch she had hidden beneath her habit all day. The men had searched the hills. They found nothing. Because God had made time, and she had used it. She hadn't dared return to the cave until nightfall, when even the shadows were sleeping. Boone Carter was still alive, but just barely. His skin was fevered, his breath shallow. She fed him what bread she had pressed cool cloths to his brow and whispered prayers over his broken body. But it wasn't enough. She couldn't carry this burden alone anymore. She needed someone wiser, someone she trusted more than herself. So she climbed the creaking stairs to Father Matthias's quarters, her mentor, her confessor, the only man of God she had ever feared disappointing. He opened the door in silence, his eyes lined with years of wear and grace. He saw the pouch before she said a word. "What have you done, child?" he asked gently. "I found a man wounded," she said. "He used to work for the railroad. He's carrying documents, maps, contracts, letters. They prove the company has been stealing land, lying to families, cheating them of what's rightfully theirs." She placed the pouch on his table, her hands trembling. "I hid him in the hills. I lied to protect him, to protect what's in here." Father Matthias sat slowly, running his fingers over the worn leather. He didn't speak for a long time. "I was taught never to question authority," Abigail whispered. "Never to break a vow. But these men, they serve money, not justice. I couldn't watch him die. I couldn't let this truth be buried." Father Matthias looked up at her, and to her surprise, there were tears in his eyes. "You haven't broken your vows," he said. "You've fulfilled them. Christ didn't die for obedience. He died for love, for truth, for justice." Then he opened the pouch. Inside were deeds, survey maps, lists of landowners, including names they both knew. The Crawfords, the Johnsons, the Millers. Good people, church people. They've already sold their land for pennies, Abigail said, not knowing its worth. Father Matthias nodded grimly. Then we will show them the truth. And so it began. Quietly under lantern light and scripture, the priest and the nun copied the documents by hand. Over the next week, they visited each family under the guise of prayer and pastoral concern. What they revealed gently, prayerfully, set hearts on fire. Whispers turned to questions, questions turned to anger, and anger in time would turn to righteous resistance. Sister Abigail hadn't sought rebellion. She had simply followed a pig. But in doing so, she'd unearthed something holier than silence. The truth. And in the eyes of heaven, that was reason enough to fight. If stories of quiet faith, moral courage, and God's timing speak to your heart, take a moment to subscribe, like the video, and share in the comments. Have you ever seen truth bloom in silence, or justice rise from the most unlikely hands? Your words matter here, just like Sister Abigail's did when no one else would speak. Now let's return to the valley, where a nun's quiet defiance was about to stir the dust and the hearts of every soul it touched. 3 weeks after Sister Abigail first knelt beside a dying man in the rocks, the valley was no longer silent. Gone were the whispers. In their place came voices clear, strong, united. Fathers who'd nearly lost their farms, mothers who'd signed crooked contracts. Men and women who had trusted the company, trusted the law, and learned it was never on their side. And in the middle of it all stood a nun, in a faded habit, her rosary worn smooth from prayer and from war. They called it a reckoning. It began the morning federal officials arrived, summoned by Father Matthias, with copies of the railroad's fraudulent papers. Sister Abigail stood behind him on the courthouse steps, holding Boone Carter's hand as he leaned on a crutch, his testimony ready. The man had survived, but just barely. And he would not run again. Inside the courtroom, the truth spilled like oil on the floor. Contracts signed under false names, maps deliberately redrawn, offers made at a fraction of market value. It was enough to shame even seasoned lawmen. And it was enough to bring justice. The railroad company was fined. Land that had been stolen was returned, and families were granted fair compensation under court order. Some called it a miracle, but Abigail knew better. It wasn't a miracle, she told a group of children outside the mission one morning. It was obedience to something greater than rules, greater than men in suits or scripture on paper. It was obedience to God's voice, when it whispers in your spirit and no one else can hear it. The convent was saved. Donations poured in from across the territory. And for the first time in years, the mission had enough money to repair the chapel roof and feed every mouth that came hungry to its doors. But not all victories came with cheers. Harrison, the shopkeeper turned traitor, vanished before trial. Others who had profited quietly from the deception never faced a courtroom. Evil Abigail realized rarely leaves through the front door. And yet justice had bloomed. Boone Carter left the valley months later, a free man with nothing to hide. But before he rode out, he left behind the worn leather pouch that had changed everything. Sister Abigail kept it in the chapel beside the baptismal font, not as a relic of war, but as a reminder of conscience. Sometimes she'd catch parishioners glancing at it during Mass, as if it held more than old papers, as if it still hummed with the courage it took to stand up when everyone else stayed quiet. In a world that often worshipped money, control, and comfort, one quiet nun had reminded them that the greatest power wasn't in land or law. It was in truth, in mercy, and in choosing when the moment came not to turn away. Even if that truth came squealing on 4 muddy hooves. This story is a reminder that truth is sacred. And sometimes standing for what is right means walking alone into danger, into doubt, and into places where faith is tested. Sister Abigail teaches us that obedience to God doesn't always mean silence or submission. Sometimes it means rising with courage when injustice hides behind power. Her journey reminds us that small acts of mercy, like helping a wounded stranger, can spark great change. In a world hungry for justice and afraid of consequences, the Lord calls us to be bold in compassion and unwavering in truth. As Scripture says in Proverbs 31:8, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves." This is the message of the cross, not comfort but courage, a call to protect the vulnerable, expose evil, and trust that God's light will always overcome the dark, even when that light begins with a humble nun and a runaway pig. If this story spoke to you, don't stop here. Click on the next video to hear another tale where faith is tested, truth is buried deep, and redemption rides in when all hope seems lost. I'll be waiting for you there just beyond the next ridge.